He is perhaps the most heroic American whose name you have never heard. Today, I want to tell you his amazing story. And I'm going to tell you his story because in ways I will attempt to show you today, it is also your story and my story. We can have the first slide up, please. The man I'm going to talk to you about, I was warned there might be some technical difficulties. We'll see how that goes. Okay, this is the man I'm talking about, Elihu Benjamin Washburn. He was born in 1816 in Livermore, Maine, and he had a hard childhood, as many children did in those days. His father contracted debts, and Elihu had to work in the summers to pay them off. All summer long, he worked from dawn to dusk, digging stumps, driving oxen to the plow, cutting and putting up hay, and he was paid $5 a month for doing that. Understandably, he left home at 17 to try his hand at something else. He tried different jobs before deciding at age 20 to study law, which he did. A friend and mentor helped pay his way through Harvard, after which he passed the bar. And then he moved to Illinois, which in those days was the frontier. And there was a great demand for lawyers at that time, a lot of litigation going on. In 1852, he had established an excellent reputation as an honest and capable man, and so he was elected to Congress for that area of Illinois. And while he was in Washington, he became friends with another Illinois lawyer, a certain Abraham Lincoln. And around that same time, he met a junior Army officer named Ulysses Grant, and their friendship grew and developed over the years. Elihu Washburn became a close advisor to President Lincoln through the war, and he would often go to the front lines to visit with General Grant as the war progressed. Lincoln would send him there in person because we think fake news is a new thing now, but there's always been fake news, and the things that were printed in the newspapers couldn't always be trusted. So he needed a trusted associate he could send to the front lines and find out what's really happening in the war. And that set of eyes was often Elihu Washburn. He later backed President Grant's presidential campaign. And so, in 1869, Grant appointed Elihu Washburn ambassador to France. France was considered the most civilized, developed country in the world, and Western civilization certainly at that time. And so when Washburn was appointed, there was a lot of complaining. You're sending this guy off the frontier to represent our nation to the most developed country in Western civilization? They talked about him as if he was kind of a country bumpkin. How was he going to properly represent the United States in the court of France? But on he went. He wrote at that time about international travel. He said, "My great enjoyment of being abroad is in being away from home and out of the incessant turmoil, strife, labor, and excitement of political life." He thought he was going to have a break in Paris, one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Elihu Washburn could not imagine that he was going to live through one of the worst periods in French history, a period that most of the time Americans know very little about. Let me give you some background. For several years in Prussia, the Kingdom of Prussia was the area of Germany around the city of Berlin. There was no Germany at the time. There were individual principalities here and there. For several years in Prussia, the premier, Otto von Bismarck, had been maneuvering to get all of the other German principalities to unite under the King of Prussia. He wanted to create the state of Germany. And he decided that the best way to do that was to instigate, to provoke a war with France and win. Because if France would declare war on a German principality, that would frighten all the others, and they would think we need to band together for our own protection. And if Prussia, little Prussia, could defeat the great nation of France, what better leadership to unite under? So he began provoking the French with insulting texts or ambiguous texts, trying to goad France into declaring war. And he succeeded. The Franco-Prussian War was declared on July 15, 1870. So this was just a few years after the American Civil War, so the armaments and the uniforms and the tactics were fairly similar. French Emperor Napoleon III, who was a nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, the great French general and emperor, he led the army to the front. His name was supposed to be a very powerful goad to the French army and give them confidence. Napoleon was leading them. How could they lose? Sadly, the French army was nothing like what it had been 60 or 70 years earlier. The army was badly organized, poorly supplied, and not very well led. And yet, off to the border of Germany, what is today Germany, they went. The Prussian army was led by King Wilhelm I, who was a soldier by profession. He'd spent his life in the army as well as being king. He was the first professional soldier to sit on the Prussian throne since Frederick the Great. As the war began between France and Prussia, all the ambassadors of the great powers left Paris to go to safety, all except the American ambassador. He was told by the President of the United States and the Secretary of State that he was free to leave. He could take his family and go. But he wrote back, "This is my place where duty calls me, and here I must remain." This is my place where duty calls me, and here I must remain. We all understand that there are certain careers, there are certain callings, there are certain commitments which require people to stay at their posts even in difficult and dangerous circumstances. He felt being the American ambassador was one such calling. Today we're going to consider the fact that Christianity is also such a calling. Christians are called to be spiritual warriors in a challenging time. But then ever since the church has been founded by Jesus Christ, it's been a challenging time to be a Christian. It's been challenging for the people with whom God decides to work. It was in the first century, it is today. It will become increasingly so as we approach the time of the end. Look at Philippians chapter 2, verse 14, please, if you would. Philippians chapter 2, verse 14. It says there, "Do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God, without fault, in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain or labored in vain." That's a good description, one of several, of our calling. We are to be children of God without fault, but living in the midst of a perverse and crooked generation. That's a challenging assignment. That's a challenging assignment, but that's our calling. Christianity is our posting. It's never been easy to be a Christian since the time that Christ began the church. But based on what we understand of the prophecies in the Bible, it's going to become more difficult, more challenging, more stressful the closer we come to the return of Christ and the end of what Galatians 1 verse 4 calls this present evil age. We live in an evil age. I first gave a presentation talking about Elihu Washburn at the Winter Family Weekend last year. And the theme of the Winter Family Weekend last year was Armor Up. So all of the presentations had to do with the idea of putting on our Christian armor. And of course, one of the places where that analogy is used is Ephesians chapter 6, starting in verse 10. Let's read that together, please. Ephesians 6, verse 10. And we'll read up through the end of verse 20. Ephesians 6, verse 10. "Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For ye do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. Stand, therefore, having girded your waist with the truth, having put on the breastplate of righteousness, having shod your feet with the preparation of the gospel of peace. Above all, taking the shield of faith, with which you may be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked one, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit, being watchful to this end with all perseverance and supplication for all the saints, and for me, that utterance may be given to me, that I may open my mouth boldly to make known the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains, that in it I may speak boldly as I ought to speak. Let me underscore a few things in the passage that we just read. It says in verse 11, we need the whole armor of God. So when we read this list, we're not just going down saying, yeah, I want that one. No, I don't really think I need this one. I'm not going to be using that. We need the whole armor. If there's an empty place, if there's a gap in our armor, then that's where Satan will hone in, and we'll be unarmed and unarmored in that place. We need it all. Verse 12 talks about the wiles of the devil. Wiles, trickiness, cunning. We have a malevolent, tricky, and merciless adversary. There is no mercy in Satan the devil. He simply wants to destroy. Verse 13 says that we should be able to stand in the evil day. There will come crunch times for us as Christians, crucial moments, turning points, times of dire trial, when all of our preparations and our armor will be tested and plumbed. Verse 18 says, to be watchful in this with all perseverance. Sometimes, as Christians, the crucial quality will be that, to tie a knot on the end of the rope and hang on a little longer. Perseverance, hanging in there, stubbornness to do the right thing. One of the lessons of the parable of the sower and the seeds, is the necessity of perseverance, the necessity of endurance, to stay at one's post and do one's duty all the way to the end. Let's be reminded of that in Matthew chapter 13. Matthew chapter 13, starting in verse 1. On the same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the sea, and great multitudes were gathered together to him, so that he got into a boat and sat, and the whole multitude stood on the shore. That's a first century sound system. They didn't have microphones, of course, but if you're out in a boat, your voice is bouncing off the waters, and it can be heard by a vast crowd of people, and so that's what Jesus did. Then he spoke many things to them in parables, saying, Behold, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seed fell by the wayside, and the birds came and devoured them. Some fell on stony places where they did not have much earth, and they immediately sprang up because they had no depth of earth. But when the sun was up, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. Some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprang up and choked them. But others fell on good ground, and yielded a crop, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. We have ears to hear. Most of the people in the world, even the Christian world, have not been given ears to hear. They read these words and they don't understand what they mean. They don't understand the kingdom of God and all that's being revealed here. In verse 18, we have the explanation given. Therefore, hear the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, then the wicked one comes and snatches away what was sown in his heart. This is he who receives seed by the wayside. But he who received the seed on stony places, this is he who receives the word and immediately receives it with joy, Yet he has no root in himself, and he endures only for a while. He doesn't endure to the end. He endures for a while, and then he gives up because he's not deep enough. He hasn't had deep enough roots. For when tribulation or persecution arise because of the word, immediately he stumbles. He's not persevering to the end. And the enemies are tribulation, trials, painful moments, or persecution, active opposition from other people who disagree with what we believe and will like to silence us. Those are things that make people give up. He who receives seed among the thorns is he who hears the word, and the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the world, and he becomes unfruitful. But he who receives seed on the good ground is he who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and produces some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. One of the key elements to be successful, to win as a Christian, to seize that reward at the end of our lives, is perseverance, staying at our post. So my message today, the point of the sermon, is to encourage all of us to be very firmly fixed in our minds and in our spirits, and to regularly ask for God's help so that we can follow through on this intention, to fix our will to say, I will stand to my post, I will do my duty until the end, come what may. In early August 1871, Elihu Washburn, along with the rest of France, was waiting for news of the war in Lorraine. This is rather close to me because that used to be part of my pastorate. I was a pastor in France for 9 years, and this was one of the areas where I pastored, Alsace and Lorraine. He was waiting for that news. In the 6 weeks after the outbreak of the war, Elihu Washburn helped over 3,000 Americans leave Paris. The mood in the city was angry and fearful. There was hatred against anyone who spoke German, and there were a lot of menial, blue-collar, German-speaking workers in Paris at the time. German workers were sometimes arrested as spies. Some were even shot. Others streamed to the American embassy for help. The Prussian government asked Elihu Washburn to help those native Germans get back home again. They sent Ambassador Washburn the equivalent of $600,000 in order to be able to help them leave Paris and get back to their homes. So Elihu Washburn began visiting prisons and intervening to help get innocent workers out of jail. He helped feed their families while the husband and the breadwinner was incarcerated. Not only was he helping Americans get out of the city, but he was helping thousands of mostly poor German refugees get home as well. The American legation in Paris helped 30,000 North Germans leave the country and get safely back to their homes. The American legation also set up an American mobile hospital, which they called the American ambulance. That was the name that was used, and it was the best equipped medical station in the whole city of Paris. On September 3rd, news arrived that the French army had been decisively defeated at the town of Sedan. Emperor Napoleon III had been captured along with his army. Within days, he would have to go into exile. A new provisional Republican government was declared, and Elihu Washburn asked that the United States be the first country in the world to recognize the new republic. It was no longer an empire, and America was the first to do so. So let me show you a few slides now, if we can have the next one. So this is the area where the Battle of Sedan took place, right on the border between what is today Germany and France. Next slide. Here's a close-up view of the border area. Next slide. This is a depiction of what the battle would have been like. You can see the uniforms are very like American Civil War uniforms. Next slide. Photograph of a Prussian army on the move. Next slide. And this is an artist's rendition of a meeting between Napoleon III on the left and Bismarck on the right. Apparently they did sit down after Napoleon was captured, and they had a talk among statesmen and decided what was going to be the next step. The new Republican government in France refused to surrender to the Prussians. So, Prussian General von Moltke sent the order out to the Prussian army, "Nach Paris, we march on Paris." And so they did. Paris prepared for a siege. There were still complete walls around Paris at the time and big military bastions full of artillery. So Paris prepared to be besieged. Herds of cattle and sheep were driven within the city walls, along with as much other food as possible. Forts around the city prepared for battle. And finally, on September 17th, the Prussian army arrived and surrounded Paris, and the siege began. The siege was going to last for 4.5 months, and Elihu Washburn stayed at his post that entire time. There were daily artillery bombardments of the city, kind of random. During the winter of 1870, 1871, it was one of the coldest winters on record. The Seine River froze solid. There wasn't enough fuel in the city to keep warm. All the trees were cut down, but still citizens froze to death. Food stores ran low. Butcher shops that initially sold beef and mutton began selling not only that, but horses, and then mules, and then dogs, and then cats, and then rats. You go to the butcher shop and buy rat meat to eat. Pneumonia, smallpox, and cholera killed thousands. As many as 4,000 Parisians a week. That's more than 4 times the normal. Washburn negotiated with Bismarck to allow any remaining Americans who had stayed that far to be able to leave the city of Paris, and Bismarck accepted. Finally, on January 28th, an armistice was signed. France surrendered. The war was over. The Prussians retreated, but not immediately. Let's look at a few more pictures. So here's some brave, confident Parisians heading to the walls to try to defend themselves against the Prussians. Next slide. Prussian artillery firing shells into Paris. Next slide. Some of the damage done in Paris by these random artillery attacks. Next slide. Finally, victory. The Prussians had a great military triumphant parade through the city of Paris, and they went home, but not before they did one last thing. Slide, please. King Wilhelm I was named Kaiser Wilhelm, the Emperor of the German Empire. If you've been to Paris, you may recognize this location. It's very famous. This is the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, just outside of Paris. Before the Prussians left, they crowned their emperor in Paris in the Hall of Mirrors, where Louis XIV used to sit. Then they went home. And of course, we know now that this German Empire was going to cause an immense tally of dead and death and destruction through world wars, not too far off into the future. They crowned the King of Prussia Kaiser Wilhelm I. The Prussians then marched home in good order. And Paris breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, it was over, they thought. But it wasn't over. In fact, the troubles of Paris and of Elihu Washburn were far from over. We'll come back to the story in a moment. What Elihu Washburn needed to do was not hard to understand. He needed to help Americans get out of Paris. He agreed to help innocent Germans get out of Paris and France. He needed to retain a good relationship between his own country, the country he represented, and the country where he was posted, and he did so. Made sure the United States was the first to recognize the new Republican government as official. It wasn't hard to understand, but as we can imagine, it was very hard to do sometimes because of what was going on all around him. Artillery barrages and shortages of food and starvation and death as he was trying to fulfill his mission. In a similar way, Our job as Christians, our responsibilities they're not hard to understand. I could probably take a small child out of the congregation here and ask, what are you supposed to do to be a Christian? And they would have an answer. Well, we must keep the 10 Commandments, or we must honor God and do His will. That's not hard to understand. Solomon summed it up really simply in Ecclesiastes 12, verses 13 and 14. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is man's all. That's all we have to do. Fear God and keep His commandments. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. Simple. Learn God's will, do it. Not hard. Easy to understand. But as we see more and more, as we watch world events and even what's going on within our own country, living as Christians is going to bring additional pressure on us as time goes forward. Because there are people that hate Christianity. They'll openly state they hate the idea of God. And they want to stamp that out if they can. Living as Christians will bring pressure on us. It will bring persecution on us. It will bring hatred on us, if it has not already done so. We need to be prepared for that. We need to know that that's coming, so that we can stand to our post and do our duty to the end, come what may. Jesus warned His disciples about that. If you'll turn to Matthew chapter 10, He didn't hide from them what they were volunteering to do, what they were signing up for. And the words are there for us today to understand as well. Matthew chapter 10, starting in verse 16. Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. We are sheep being sent out among wolves. Usually that doesn't end up well for the sheep. We have the help of God, otherwise it would be a lost cause. But with that help, anything is possible. But beware of men, for they will deliver you up to councils and scourge you in their synagogues, and you will be brought before governors and kings for my name's sake, as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles. But when they deliver you up, do not worry about how or what you shall speak, for it will be given to you in that hour what you should speak. Verse 20, for it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father who speaks in you. Now brother will deliver up brother to death, and a father his child, and children will rise up against their parents and cause them to be put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but he who endures to the end will be saved. When they persecute you in this city, flee to another. For assuredly I say to you, you will not have gone through the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. It's enough for a disciple that he be like his teacher, and a servant like his master. If they have called the master of the house Beelzebub, how much more will they call those of his household? Therefore do not fear them, for there is nothing covered that will not be revealed, and hidden that will not be known. Whatever I tell you in the dark, speak in the light, and what you hear in the ear, preach on the housetop. And do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a copper coin, and not one of them falls to the ground apart from your Father's will? But the very hairs on your head are numbered. Do not fear, therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows. Therefore, whoever confesses me before men, him I will also confess before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, him will I also deny before my Father who's in heaven. Have you ever thought about what that means? I think it's easy to understand how Jesus might deny someone before the Father, but what does it mean to confess someone's name before the Father? Jesus said that's what's going to happen. Now, you can imagine it as you will, and I encourage you to imagine it. Let me share with you my imagination of what this is. I imagine there's going to be a time when each one of us is presented to God the Father. And Jesus Christ is going to read out the services of distinction that we did, that we performed for him. Father, here is this child of yours. I know you know everything about him or her, but I want to say his name in your presence and in the presence of all the holy angels and acknowledge his submission to your will. Wow. I wouldn't want to miss something like that for anything. Can you imagine it? I encourage you to imagine it. Those are things we need to imagine and remember those promises that are given to us. Verse 34, do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's foes will be those of his own household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. He who finds his life will lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake will find it. We haven't really known a time like that in our lifetime, as our predecessors in the faith did. There were martyrs. These words came true for many people, many Christians in the past. And the Bible foretells times that will be like this once again before the return of Jesus Christ. It's important for us to think about that and have it in our minds. Will we leave our post? Will we abandon our duty when trials and persecutions arrive? We must not. To this we are called, to stand to our post and do our Christian duty, throwing a lifeline, a spiritual lifeline, to all who are willing to hear. And God will save some by the message that we're collectively preaching, that the church is putting out on the internet and in various other ways. God will save some through that message, through the message that each of us preaches by living a Christian lifestyle that attracts attention from other people. There's something different about this person. He's honest. He tells the truth, but gently and kindly. She's always willing to help if I'm in need. That's going to become rarer and rarer and rarer as we go along. We each, one, will have a responsibility. We each have responsibilities. Some parts of our responsibilities are the same among all of us. We all share some responsibilities as Christians. But some responsibilities will be particular to individuals. Some responsibilities may differ from Christian to Christian. That's for God to decide. He decides what he will lay upon each one of us. But we each are entrusted with a charge to carry, a load to bear. In fact, the Bible uses that very term to talk about our responsibilities. Look in Galatians chapter 6, verse 3. Galatians chapter 6, verse 3. For if anyone thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one examine his own work, and then he will have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another, for each one shall bear his own load. We have a load to carry. God has placed a load on us. He knows how much we can carry. He gives us extra strength when needed. But it's our responsibility to shoulder that load, whatever it is, and carry it through to the end of our course. Each one shall bear his own load. Of course, the Bible also encourages us, when we have the opportunity to do so, to bear one another's loads, to help each other. Verse 2, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. We're each responsible for our own load, our own burden, but when we have the chance, we should try to lighten others' burdens, whenever we can do that. Maybe we can think of the scene when Frodo and Sam are climbing the last stretch of Mount Doom, and Frodo falters and says he can't go on anymore. And Sam says, "Come, Mr. Frodo, I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you and it as well. So I'll get you up. Come on, Mr. Frodo, Sam will give you a ride. You just tell him where to go and he'll take you." Maybe we'll have the opportunity to do something like that for each other in the future. We should be looking for opportunities to do that, to bear one another's burdens. It's very important. And through that whole process of bearing burdens and moving forward, facing opposition and persecution, we will be in God's hands the whole time. He never loses anyone, never gets distracted, he's never inattentive. He always knows exactly what's happening in our lives. He's watching, he's intervening, he's strengthening, he's protecting all of us in order to accomplish his perfect will through his beloved children. What an honor it is to be counted among the number of God's children, the elect with whom he's working today. Ultimately, the greatest danger to Elihu Washburn and to many Parisians were not the Prussians. It turned out to be other Parisians. This is the story that few Americans know about. After the French government signed an armistice, it was too weak to immediately reestablish order in Paris, to invest the city. And so local groups of radical National Guards with what we would today call communist sympathies, the word didn't really exist at the time or wasn't widely used, they took weapons from armories and they rose up and took control of the city using tactics similar to some things that we've seen, sadly, in the United States recently, burning neighborhoods, shooting at people, taking over, declaring autonomous zones. In fact, they declared Paris an autonomous zone. It had seceded from France. It was its own commune. And the people who supported that came to be known as communards. Communards. They took anything valuable that they wanted, they looted, they burned. Finally, Paris was taken over and declared to be the Paris Commune. They declared Paris independent of France, and the legal French government fled the city to avoid being taken as hostage, and they went to Versailles. Now, Versailles is only about 20 miles outside of Paris, so it was close. And then came a time of mob rule. Mobs murdered government officials. Barricades went up around the city. On March 22nd, a crowd of respectable citizens protested the violence that was going on before the headquarters of the National Guard. Unarmed, fine, upstanding citizens, the Communard commander ordered his troops to open fire, and 30 people were shot dead in cold blood. They patterned themselves after the Reign of Terror, which you have heard about probably from 1789, the French Revolution, guillotines, etc. They patterned themselves on that. It was in Paris a new reign of terror. And still, Elihu Washburn stayed at his post. There were still Americans in the city who needed his help and his protection. His staff continued to run the mobile hospital. Communards looted the city. They took hostages to keep the government troops from re-entering and from attacking. One of the hostages they took was the Catholic Archbishop of Paris. And because Elihu Washburn intervened and asked for his release, certain communards began preparing to have him arrested and shot. That never happened. And the Archbishop of Paris was murdered by a firing squad, not having done anything wrong. It was one of the darkest periods of French history. And Elihu Washburn stood to his post and did his duty, come what may. Let's look at some more slides. This is what Paris looked like at the end of the Commune. Because finally, the government did break through and take the city. There was hand-to-hand fighting before the Commune was finally crushed, and the last of them were shot against a cemetery wall, Père Lachaise Cemetery, famous cemetery in Paris. It's interesting to note, in passing, that Karl Marx and Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, also known as Lenin, and other communists studied the Paris Commune very closely. They wanted to see what worked and why did it ultimately fail. They studied it closely because they wanted to emulate it and carry it all the way through, which Lenin finally did. And we know the results that that gave. Next slide. Burned out section of what is today part of the Louvre. Next slide. This was Paris City Hall that was completely burned out as well. Next slide. There are no actual photographs of the execution of the Catholic priest, but this was an artist's rendition of it. The worst, probably the worst period in all of the history of France. So you see what I mean when I said that the greatest threat to Paris and to Elihu Washburn and to most Parisians that threat was other Parisians. And I would ask that you keep that in mind as well about our calling. Because the Bible indicates that in the future, one of the greatest threats to true faithful Christians will be unfaithful Christians, lapsed Christians. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3. Second Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, the beast, the false prophet. This is a future thing. Who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself or claiming that he is God. The day, the return of Christ, will not come unless there's a falling away first. Has that already happened? We wondered that when our original church association fell apart and so many people went back into the world. I think that's just a foretaste, because this is placing those events really in the context of the end time, just before the return of Jesus Christ, when the pressure in the world reaches a boiling point. Back in Matthew 24, Jesus spoke about this time as well. Matthew 24, verse 9. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And many will be offended and betray one another and will hate one another. Is this talking about people in the world? Doesn't seem to be. This could be something that happens in the church. Many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. People in the world? He's talking to his disciples. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. A falling away. Maybe that's happened in part already. But perhaps, I would say even certainly not all of it has happened because of the conceptualization. What's the context for this? It's just before the return of Jesus Christ. That kind of betrayal and tribulation has not happened yet. No one's been killed, but it's going to. One of the greatest dangers to Christians in the future will be Christians who have abandoned their post and betrayed their duties and gone back into the world. We must not let that happen to us, brethren. There are a lot of zombie movies going on out there in the entertainment world. I'm not recommending zombie movies. Kids, don't tell your parents, Mr. Meeker said I could go. No. Not saying you can go. But you probably know, if you've never watched one, you probably know the general idea. It's kind of entered our popular culture now, what happens with zombies. You know, they're walking around, they're called the undead sometimes because they're dead, but they're still walking around. And you probably know how this works, that if a zombie bites you, you don't die. You turn into a zombie. And you're not thinking anymore, so you're just going out trying to bite as many other people as you can. I think some of them Don't they live on people's brains? I haven't really gone into that very deeply, but anyway. So the people who maybe they were trying to defend their family and their friends from the zombie hordes, then they get bitten and they go over and join the other side, and they come and they become a danger to their family and their friends. I think, brethren, we're going to see zombie Christians in the future. They're going to go over to the other side and turn against those that they once defended and loved and tried to protect. We must not let that happen to us. See, there's more riding on our faithfulness than just our own lives. If we abandon our post, we abandon our responsibilities, we could well become a danger to faithful Christians in the future. That should steel our resolve to always stand to our post and do our duties to the end, come what may. Christians, unchristians, will abandon their post, and some will join forces with evil and turn their former brethren over to evil men, even to be killed. So you see, the importance of standing to our post and doing our duty goes beyond, as I said, our own lives. The importance of that is a protection to our family and our friends and our loved ones. It's a way of protecting our brethren from what we could become. Zombie Christian, unchristian, Christian killers. It's going to happen to some. What a horrible thing to have on a record. We must resolve that we will not be among that shameful number. We need to do what's written about the Messiah in Isaiah 50. Isaiah chapter 50. Starting in verse 4. Isaiah 50, starting in verse 4. This is a prophetic, a prophecy about the Messiah here that we have, a prophetic passage. Isaiah 50, verse 4, prophecy of what Jesus Christ was going to do. The Lord God has given me the tongue of the learned that I should know how to speak, a word in season to him who is weary. He awakens me morning by morning. He awakens my ear to hear as the learned. The Lord God has opened my ear, and I was not rebellious, nor did I turn away. I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who have plucked out the beard. Gentlemen, have you ever accidentally plucked out a beard? A whisker? You get a dull razor sometime and it pulls it out instead of cutting it off. That hurts. Really hurts. That's why people buy new razor blades, because it hurts. Why would they do that to the Messiah? Just to cause gratuitous pain, for no reason, just to hurt him. I've given my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who plucked out the beard. I did not hide my face from shame and spitting. For the Lord God will help me, therefore I will not be disgraced, not in the true sense of the word, not before God. Therefore I have set my face like a flint, and I know that I will not be ashamed. I have set my face like a flint. A flint is a very hard stone. When you strike flint against steel, you get a spark. Flint is very, very hard. This prophecy said that Jesus Christ set his face like a flint, not to turn away from his duty, from obedience to his Father. We need to do this too, brethren. Set our faces like flint. I will not turn away. So help me God. We need to ask God to strengthen our will, as well as strengthen us in other ways, so that we'll never abandon our post or abandon our duty. When Paris was finally free, Elihu Washburn was regarded, rightly so, as a hero. Not bad for a country bumpkin, huh? Otto von Bismarck sent him a letter thanking him for all he had done for innocent German civilians. Quote, "His Majesty has commanded me to convey to Your Excellency the grateful acknowledgement for the zeal and kindness you devoted to the interests of the German residents under circumstances of extraordinary difficulty and with corresponding sacrifices of time and personal comfort." Newspapers sang his praises. One American paper wrote, "Paris was deserted by the titled and the great. It witnessed starvation and death and all manner of disaster. Mr. Washburn still remained at his post, throwing himself between the ranks of arrayed Frenchmen, fighting in a horrible death struggle, saving all that he could." Saving all that he could. The New York Tribune wrote, "We do not recall an instance in our diplomacy of a more brilliant and successful performance of duty in circumstances of such gravity and delicacy." His assistant for the American legation wrote of him, "Hasn't our minister in Paris done splendidly? By the use of common sense, a kindly disposition, and a true appreciation of the right, he has, during the past year, brought more credit to our government and people at home than they can ever reward him for. His name is on every tongue, and I'm sure that he will not escape the fate of other honest men for whom thousands of boy babies have and will affectionately and admiringly be named." And there were a lot of Elihu's in the coming years. Washburn was offered great honors by President Grant. He turned them all down. He said, "Just write me a letter of thanks. That's all I want." He didn't want to become too famous, he said. And when he finished there as a very much loved ambassador to France, he resigned at the end of Grant's presidency, and he went home to his farm and enjoyed his family. As I said, he's probably one of the bravest, most exemplary Americans you've never heard of. One of the reasons you'd never heard of him before, I believe, is because while it was known from other references that a journal existed, he'd kept a journal somewhere, it was only discovered about a dozen years ago in the Library of Congress by a research assistant to David McCullough, the historian who died just recently. As the research assistant was going through old volumes, he came across a book with a journal in the margins. Lacking writing paper, Elihu Washburn had kept his journal in the margins of another book. And if you're interested, parts of his journal, along with historical background and other things, have been printed. I have a copy of it at home. It's really interesting, fascinating read, very quick. If that's interesting to you at all, I encourage you to have a look at it. A very exemplary American that we've never heard of before. The times ahead of us are going to be challenging, brethren. But after that will come an eternal reward. No more suffering, no more pain, no more worry. All of that will be history. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, just before we close. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, starting in verse 16. Second Corinthians 4, verse 16. "Therefore, we do not lose heart. Even though our outward man is perishing," we're all getting older, and we know what awaits us at some point, "yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. For our light affliction," wait a minute, light affliction? This is written by a man who was stoned nearly to death, perhaps to death. He was whipped. He was shipwrecked and spent days floating around in a stormy Mediterranean. He was persecuted by his countrymen, hated by many people, had to be lowered down in a basket over the wall of a city to escape being murdered. Light affliction? What would he think of as heavy affliction? No, it's light affliction because he's looking at it in the context of history. In the context of eternity, all those things are light affliction. Our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, while we do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. Let's follow a sentence pronounced by John F. Kennedy. Do not pray for easy lives, pray to be stronger men. Let us pray to be stronger Christians so that we can armor up as a key to spiritual strength, so we can have the resolution and the commitment that we will always stay at our post and do our duty to the end, come what may.